There's something you did today without thinking. Something you do every single day and never give a second thought. Something so ordinary, so invisible that you have probably never paused to ask what would happen if you actually paid attention to it. You walked, maybe 10 steps to the kitchen, maybe a quick crossing of the parking lot, maybe just from your desk to the bathroom and back. But you did it. And while you did, your body executed one of the most intricate choreographies in nature. 200 muscles firing in sequence, 26 bones in each foot adjusting to every imperfection of the ground, your brain recalculating your balance 1,000 times a second so you wouldn't fall. And you, the whole time, were thinking about something else. That is about to change because what I'm going to share with you isn't an anatomy lesson. It isn't a fitness manual. It's something more uncomfortable than that. It's the possibility that the simplest act of your life is also the most powerful one, and that you've been ignoring it. Let's start at the beginning, not your beginning or mine, but the beginning of everything. 4.5 million years ago, on an African savanna that no longer exists, a hominid did something no primate had ever done in any sustained way before. He stood up and walked on two legs. He didn't run. He didn't jump. He walked. And that single act, clumsy, wobbly, almost certainly ridiculous to any chimpanzee watching from the trees, changed the history of the planet. By standing up, he freed his hands. With his hands free, he made tools. With tools, he hunted better. With better food, his brain grew. With a larger brain, he invented language, fire, agriculture, writing, the wheel, and eventually the device you are probably listening to this on right now. It all began with a step. I'm not exaggerating when I say walking is what made us human. Intelligence didn't come first. Language didn't come first. The act of standing up and moving on two legs came first. Bipedalism predates everything we now consider distinctly human. We walked before we thought. And here's the irony that defines our age. The species that was designed to walk has become the species that sits. We sit for an average of 10 to 12 hours a day. We sit to work, to eat, to travel, to be entertained, to rest. We have built entire cities where walking is not just unnecessary, but in many places almost impossible. And our bodies are paying the bill. But before we talk about what we lose when we stop walking, let's talk about what we gain when we don't. Because the numbers are so striking, they're almost hard to believe. A meta-analysis published by the European Society of Cardiology examined 17 studies covering more than 226,000 people. The question was simple. How many steps a day do you need to start living longer? The answer surprised everyone. 2,337. That's it. Less than 2 kilometers. Less than 20 minutes at a normal pace. From that point on, you're already lowering your risk of cardiovascular death. It only gets better. Every additional 1,000 steps cuts your overall mortality by 15%. Every additional 500 steps cuts your cardiovascular mortality by 7%. We are not talking about marathons. We are not talking about deadlifts or spin classes. We are talking about putting one foot in front of the other. But there's a nuance worth listening to carefully. A study published in 2025 in the Annals of Internal Medicine looked at more than 33,000 adults and found something that shifts the whole conversation. It isn't only how much you walk, but how you walk. People who walked in continuous sessions of more than 15 minutes had radically different outcomes than those who got the same number of steps in scattered bursts of less than 5 minutes. The mortality difference between the two groups was 5 to 1. What does that mean in practice? It means walking from your desk to the bathroom and back, even though it technically counts as steps, doesn't produce the same effect as actually going outside and walking for 20 minutes without stopping. The body needs continuity to switch on the mechanisms that really matter. And then there is speed. A Vanderbilt University study followed nearly 85,000 people for 16 years and found that brisk walking, not jogging, just walking with intent, for as little as 15 minutes a day reduces total mortality by almost 20%. 15 minutes with purpose. That's all. Now consider this. How much money do you spend each year on supplements, on gym memberships you never use, on diets you abandon by February? And the most powerful longevity intervention science has ever documented costs exactly nothing and requires exactly zero equipment. There's something almost comic about it. The wellness industry moves billions of dollars a year selling sophisticated solutions, and it turns out the answer was quite literally beneath our feet the entire time. But the story gets more interesting when we move from the heart up to the brain. The neuroscientist Shane O'Mara, in his book In Praise of Walking, presents an idea I find genuinely revealing. The human brain was not built to think while sitting. It was sculpted by millions of years of walking. Every structure, every neural pathway, every cognitive mechanism we have evolved while our ancestors were on the move. When we stop walking, we are quite literally working against our own neurological design. And this is not metaphor. The hippocampus, the brain structure essential to memory and spatial orientation, is strengthened specifically by walking, not by exercise in general, by walking, as if the brain recognizes that particular activity as the signal that everything is operating as it should. O'Mara describes something he calls mental defragmentation. When you walk, especially without a fixed destination and without digital noise, your brain enters a processing mode in which it organizes accumulated information, links ideas that seemed unconnected, and quietly solves problems that have been stuck for days. It isn't magic, it's neuroscience. But it feels like magic. Have you ever had a brilliant idea in the shower? The mechanism is similar. When the body is occupied with an automatic task, the brain frees up resources for divergent thinking. But walking does it better than the shower because alongside the automaticity, it adds bilateral movement, sensory stimulation, and, if you're outside of streeted, the visual complexity of a constantly shifting environment. A 2014 Stanford study measured this with precision. Creative output rises by 60% when you walk compared to sitting. 60%. And the effect lingers even after you sit back down. As if walking gave your brain a momentum that carries beyond the walk itself. Steve Jobs knew this by instinct long before science confirmed it. His most important meetings weren't held in conference rooms. They were 5 to 8 kilometer walks through the streets of Palo Alto. It was on a walk that he convinced John Scully to leave Pepsi and run Apple. It was on a walk that many of the ideas that reshaped an entire industry took form. He wasn't alone. Mark Zuckerberg adopted the same practice. Aristotle taught while walking the covered paths of the Lyceum 24 centuries ago, and his school of philosophy was named the Peripatetics, literally the ones who walk. Socrates walked the streets of Athens asking questions. For these thinkers, thinking and walking were not two separate activities. They were the same thing. So here's a question worth holding for a moment. How many of your best ideas have come to you while staring at a screen? And how many came while you were moving, driving, walking to the store, pacing through your kitchen at midnight? It is not coincidence. Your brain is telling you something. The question is whether you are listening. There is one finding that genuinely changes how I think about aging, and I want to share it with you. A 2024 study published in Clinical Epigenetics used a technique called Mendelian randomization to examine the relationship between walking speed and aging at the genetic level. What they found is extraordinary. People who walk faster age more slowly, not just superficially, fewer wrinkles, better posture, but at the epigenetic level. Their genes express themselves in ways that slow the very mechanisms of aging. Sit with that for a moment. The pace at which you walk may be quietly determining the pace at which you age. This connects to something the researchers behind the Blue Zones have been documenting for years. The 5 regions in the world where people live the longest, Okinawa in Japan, Sardinia in Italy, Nicoya in Costa Rica, Icaria in Greece, and Loma Linda in California, share many traits, but one appears in every single one of them: high levels of daily physical activity, with walking as the dominant form. The shepherds in the mountains of Sardinia in the province of Nuoro are the most striking example. That region has the world's highest concentration of male centenarians, roughly 21 per 100,000 inhabitants, almost 10 times a European average. These men do not go to the gym. They don't follow training programs. They simply live in mountainous terrain that demands they walk 8 to 13 kilometers a day across steep slopes to tend their sheep. Their exercise is not a conscious decision. It is a consequence of their environment and their work, and their bodies reflect that life. Dramatically lower rates of cardiovascular disease and notably low levels of dementia. Many keep their mental sharpness and mobility well into their 90s. We don't need sophisticated gyms or expensive supplements. We need terrain to walk on and a reason to do it. Dan Rubenstein, in his book Born to Walk, takes this idea further. He argues we don't have a sedentary crisis. We have a design crisis. We have built cities, offices, and schools that prevent us from walking. The problem isn't that people are lazy. The problem is that we have created a world in which sitting is the default option. Do you live in a suburb where the nearest store is 3 kilometers away on a road with no sidewalk? It isn't your fault you don't walk. It's the fault of the urban design. Do you work on the 20th floor of a corporate building where everything is solved by email? It isn't a lack of will. It's architecture that has eliminated the need to move. Rubenstein documents something hopeful. The cities that have decided to prioritize pedestrians, Copenhagen, Melbourne, Bogota, are not only healthier, they have lower crime rates, stronger social bonds, and more resilient local economies. It turns out that when people walk through streets, the streets themselves become safer, more alive, more human. This answers one of the most uncomfortable questions about walking. Is it a privilege? Who can afford to walk for pleasure, and who walks out of necessity? The answer is complicated. There are communities where walking is dangerous because of crime, where infrastructure is missing, where the air itself is hostile. There are neighborhoods where a woman cannot walk alone without harassment. There are entire cities with no functional sidewalks. Acknowledging this doesn't undermine the case for walking, it strengthens it, because it means that creating walkable spaces is not an aesthetic luxury. It is a matter of public health and basic justice. Now let's talk about something that no pedometer can measure but may matter most of all. What happens to your mind when you walk? Friedrich Nietzsche was a wreck at 34. Chronic migraines that left him vomiting for hours. Failing eyesight. He had been forced to give up his university chair in Basel. The doctors offered no hope. But he found something in the alpine paths of Sils Maria, in the Swiss Engadine. He started with timid walks. Slowly they grew into expeditions of 6, 8, even 10 hours a day. He carried a small notebook and a pencil, stopping every time an idea broke into his consciousness. Out of that decade of walking came Zarathustra, the gay science beyond good and evil. The works that redrew the map of Western philosophy were written, quite literally, on foot. Nietzsche wrote a line worth holding on to. Only thoughts reached by walking have value. It can sound like an exaggeration, but think of it through the neuroscience we've just covered. When Nietzsche walked, his brain entered exactly the kind of defragmentation O'Mara describes. The bilateral motion engaged both hemispheres. The sensory richness of the alpine landscape fed his creativity. The rhythm of his steps regulated an emotional state that was always fragile. The mountains were not his refuge. They were his laboratory. Immanuel Kant, the other great German philosopher, was his opposite in method but his twin in practice. Every afternoon at exactly 3:30, he stepped out of his house in Königsberg for the same walk along the same route. So precisely that the neighbors set their clocks by him. He never traveled more than 100 kilometers from the city of his birth. He never saw the sea. But his mind, fed by those metronomic walks, produced the three critiques that became the spine of modern thought. Only once did he skip his walk, the day he received a book by Rousseau so absorbing that he forgot to go out. The neighbors, alarmed by his absence, were certain he had died. Nietzsche walked to create. Kant walked to discipline. Thoreau walked to perceive. Rousseau walked to dream. Four enormous minds, four entirely different ways of walking, and all of them arrived at the same conclusion. They needed their legs in order to think. Frederick Groh, in his book A Philosophy of Walking, draws a distinction I find essential. He distinguishes between speed and slowness. Speed, he says, annihilates space. Slowness reveals it. When you drive at 120 kilometers an hour, the landscape is a blur. When you walk, the landscape unfolds. You see the moss on the stone, the angle of light through the trees, the insect crossing the path. And there is something deeper in that slowness. Groh argues that walking is the most democratic form of freedom that exists. It requires no money, no status, no permission. A billionaire and an unemployed worker can walk the same trail at the same pace under the same sky. In a world defined by inequality, walking is the great equalizer. Let me pause here for something practical. Because if this book only inspires you without giving you tools, it has failed at its job. Maybe you're listening to this and thinking, this sounds beautiful, but I haven't walked further than the parking lot in years. Good. That's exactly where we'll start. The science is clear. The benefits begin much earlier than you imagine. You don't need 10,000 steps. That number, by the way, doesn't come from any scientific study. It comes from a 1965 Japanese marketing campaign for a pedometer called the Manpo-K, which translates as 10,000 step meter. The number was chosen because the kanji character for 10,000 vaguely resembles a person walking, and because it sounded round and ambitious. There was no study behind it, none. It was aesthetics and advertising. For 60 years, doctors, apps, and governments repeated that figure as if it were carved in stone. It wasn't until 2019 that a Harvard study showed mortality benefits actually plateau around 7,500 steps. And the great European meta-analysis of 2023 confirmed that the benefits begin from as few as 2,300 steps. There is something quietly poetic about the whole story. A number invented by a creative engineer probably motivated millions of people to walk more than they otherwise would have. A useful fiction that saved real lives. But today we know the truth, and the truth is more generous than we thought. You don't need 10,000 steps. You need to begin. So, how do you begin if you've been sedentary for years? First, forget perfection. You don't need the perfect shoes, the perfect route, or the perfect moment. You need to walk out your door. Today, even if it's 5 minutes, even if it's just around the block, the first step doesn't need to be long. It only needs to exist. Second, aim for continuity, not quantity. 20 unbroken minutes is worth more than 40 minutes scattered into 2-minute fragments. If you can walk for 15 or 20 minutes without stopping, at a pace that makes you breathe a little deeper than usual but doesn't leave you gasping, you are in the zone where the important things happen. Third, speed matters. You don't need to jog. But walking as if you were slightly late for an appointment, with intent, with rhythm, with energy, produces dramatically better effects than ambling. Remember, 15 minutes of brisk walking lowers mortality by almost 20%. Fourth, if you can walk outside, do it. There is a real difference between walking on a treadmill and walking in the open air. Uneven ground engages stabilizing muscles a treadmill never asks for. The shifting visual field outdoors activates cognitive circuits no gym can replicate. And if you can walk among trees, the benefits multiply in ways we'll get to in a moment. Fifth, you don't need technology. A smartwatch can be useful, but it can also become a distraction that pulls you out of the experience entirely. If the watch helps you stay consistent, use it. If it turns you into someone who walks staring at a wrist instead of looking at the world, leave it at home. The question isn't how much equipment you need. The question is how much of what you already have is getting in the way of the simple act of walking. Annabelle Streets, in her book 52 Ways to Walk, expands this whole picture. There is no single correct way to walk. Variety in pace, terrain, company, time of day, weather, is the key to maximizing the benefits. Some of her observations are wonderfully counterintuitive. Walking in the rain, for example. Most of us treat rain as a reason to stay inside, but moderate exposure to rain has immune benefits you don't get in dry weather. Humid air is rich in negative ions, which are linked to better mood and clearer thinking. Walking in the cold activates a tissue called brown fat, which burns calories to produce heat. Brown fat, unlike the white fat we accumulate around our waist, is metabolically active and beneficial. Moderate cold turns it on. A winter walk isn't just bearable, it's therapeutic. Walking barefoot on natural surfaces, grass, sand, soil, activates mechanoreceptors in the sole of the foot that improve balance and proprioception, your body's sense of where it is in space. The advocates of grounding go further, claiming there are additional benefits in the direct contact with the earth, though mainstream science remains cautious about those particular claims. What is undeniable is that our feet evolved to feel the ground, and modern shoes, however comfortable, insulate us from that information. Walking at dusk is especially good for regulating circadian rhythm. Exposure to twilight light sends signals to your biological clock that prepare the body for rest, improving the quality of sleep that night. And there is a practice Streets calls sound walking. Walking while paying attention exclusively to the sounds of your surroundings. No headphones, no music, no podcasts. Just the world as it actually is. The wind, the birds, the distant traffic, your own footsteps. This practice produces meditative effects comparable to formal seated meditation. How you walk matters as much as the fact that you walk. Changing the variety of your walks can multiply their benefits. The point isn't to find the perfect walk and repeat it forever. The point is to explore every walk available to you. When was the last time you walked in the rain on purpose? When was the last time you walked barefoot on grass? When was the last time you walked without earphones, without a phone, without anything separating you from the actual sound of the world? There is a dimension to walking that science is only beginning to measure, but that the spiritual traditions have known for thousands of years. What happens to the soul, or if you prefer to consciousness itself, when the body begins to move? Walking meditation has 25 centuries of documented practice. In the Zen tradition, it is called kinhin. In the Theravada tradition, it is called kankama. The teacher Thich Nhat Hanh spent much of his life teaching a truth so simple it is almost difficult to accept. Every step can be an act of full presence. Every step can be an arrival. Not an arrival at a geographic destination, but an arrival in the present moment. The difference between ordinary walking and walking meditation is not in the speed or the technique. It is in the attention. When you walk thinking about what you have to do tomorrow, you are commuting. When you walk feeling the weight of your body shift from one foot to the other, feeling the contact of the sole against the ground, feeling the air enter through your nostrils, you are meditating. Is it possible to have a genuinely contemplative experience without any religious destination at all? Absolutely. Contemplation belongs to no tradition. It belongs to the human capacity to pay attention. And walking is perhaps the most accessible way to train that capacity. John Kabat-Zinn formalized this in his mindfulness-based stress reduction program, where walking meditation is one of the foundational practices. Not because it is religious, but because it works. Research has shown the program improves mental health across diverse populations in many countries and cultures. It isn't Buddhism. It isn't mysticism. It is an evidence-based practice that uses walking as the anchor for attention. And here, neuroscience offers a powerful explanation. The rhythmic bilateral motion of walking activates both cerebral hemispheres in alternation. This mechanism is similar to the one used by EMDR therapy to process trauma. When you walk, your brain doesn't only think more clearly, it processes difficult emotions more cleanly. The rhythm of the step acts as a natural emotional regulator. This explains something many of us already sense intuitively. When you are anxious, you need to move. When anxiety squeezes you, sitting still makes it worse. Walking does not erase distress, but it gives your nervous system the room it needs to work through it. Exposure to nature lowers cortisol, raises endorphins and serotonin, and activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which governs relaxation and recovery. Walking is not a cure for depression or anxiety, but it is one of the most powerful complementary interventions that exist. And unlike many of the others, it has no side effects, requires no prescription, and is available 24 hours a day. I want to talk now about paths. Not paths as metaphor, but the actual paths of stone and dust and earth that humanity has walked for centuries. In 1976, only 7 people completed the Camino de Santiago and received the Compostela certificate. 7. In 2024, more than 440,000 walked it. Pilgrims from over 190 countries, and only 37% walked it for strictly religious reasons. The rest walked in search of something they couldn't quite name. Something to do with silence, with simplicity, with the experience of needing only what fits in a backpack. Why does pilgrimage on foot resurge with such force in an age when you can cross the world in a single afternoon by air? For exactly that reason. Because we live in a world that has erased friction, slowness, the physical effort of getting somewhere. And something in us, something older than reason, misses that friction. The Camino gives back something modern life has quietly taken from you. The sense that arriving somewhere should cost something, that the destination is earned with the feet, not bought with a card. Robert Macfarlane, in his book The Old Ways, puts this beautifully. He argues that ancient paths are not simply surfaces to walk on, they are texts recording migrations, trade, pilgrimage, and war. Walking a historic path is a form of time travel. You connect with everyone who walked it before you. The medieval pilgrims, the Roman traders, the shepherds who carved that line into the hillside with their feet 500 years ago. The landscape shapes the walker as much as the walker shapes the landscape. It is a conversation between your body and the earth. Macfarlane walked paths from the Hebrides to Palestine, and everywhere he found the same thing. The cultures that keep their ancestral roots alive keep their identity alive. Paths are the memory of a people inscribed in the land. And there is something the Spanish poet Antonio Machado understood as well as anyone who ever lifted a pen. The path is formed by walking. Caminante, no hay camino. Wanderer, there is no road. Se hace camino al andar. The road is made by walking it. He meant something more than poetry. He meant that the routes we look at on maps, the trails we treat as fixed features of the world, were once nothing at all. They became paths because someone walked there. And then someone else followed. And then 1,000 more. Every great road on earth began with a single person who chose a direction. This is why pilgrimage matters even when you have no church to walk toward, because the path you take in your own life is also formed by walking. Not by planning, not by waiting, not by the perfect strategy. By walking. You don't find your path by staring at a map. You find it by stepping into the unknown and looking back, after some years, to see the line your feet drew. The Camino de Santiago generates more than 300 million euros a year for the rural communities of northern Spain, revitalizing villages that were emptying out. Pilgrimage tourism is one of the few industries that directly benefits the smallest, most vulnerable communities. Every pilgrim who sleeps in a village hostel, who buys bread at a local bakery, who takes a coffee in a country bar, is participating in an economy that sustains ways of life that would otherwise disappear. There is a detail I find quietly beautiful. There exists a dual pilgrim certificate for those who complete both the Camino de Santiago and the Kumano Kodo in Japan. They are the only two pilgrimage routes declared World Heritage by UNESCO. One Christian, one Shinto Buddhist, separated by 10,000 kilometers and by traditions that share almost nothing on the surface, united by the same truth. That something deeply human happens when you walk an ancient path with intent. The world's great walks are many. The Appalachian Trail covers 3,500 kilometers down the eastern spine of the United States. The Pacific Crest Trail crosses more than 4,000 kilometers of desert, mountain, and forest from Mexico to Canada. The Via Francigena links Canterbury to Rome along 1,900 kilometers. The Annapurna Circuit in Nepal threads 230 kilometers through some of the highest mountains on the planet. The Torres del Paine in Chile, the Tour du Mont Blanc through France, Italy, and Switzerland, the Gia R20 in Corsica. And there are the spiritual paths. The 88 temples of Shikoku in Japan, 1,200 kilometers walked by Buddhist pilgrims over 1 or 2 months. The Sultan's Trail, 2,500 kilometers from Vienna to Istanbul. The Sufi Trail in Turkey, 800 kilometers of Islamic tradition. How do you choose? That is one of the most common questions, and the most honest answer is this. It doesn't matter which one. What matters is that you choose one and walk it. The right path is the one you actually take. If you've never done a long walk, start with something 3 to 5 days long. The Kumano Kodo and its Nakahechi route, 72 kilometers in 3 to 6 days, is a perfect introduction. The Camino Primitivo, 320 kilometers over 2 weeks, is the oldest of the Santiago routes and the least crowded. If you are drawn to wilder country, the Milford Track in New Zealand, 53 kilometers in 4 days, is considered one of the finest walks on the planet. You don't need to be an athlete. Emma Gatewood was 67 years old, the mother of 11 children, and a survivor of a brutal life when she decided to walk the Appalachian Trail entirely alone. She didn't carry sophisticated gear, canvas sneakers, a sack slung over her shoulder, a blanket. She became the first woman to complete it solo. She walked it 3 times, the last when she was 75. When a journalist asked her why she did it, she said simply, "Because I wanted to take a walk." You don't need permission to do what your body was designed to do, but you don't need to fly to Spain or Japan to experience what these paths offer. And this matters because the danger of a book about walking is that it might convince you that only the epic pilgrimage counts. It doesn't. The power of walking lives in the daily. In stepping out your door each morning, in walking to work when you can, in choosing the sidewalk over the car when distance allows. There is a Japanese concept that complements this: Shinrin Yoku, or forest bathing. In the 1980s, Japan coined the term as an official response to the burnout of its tech workers. The Ministry of Agriculture designated 62 therapeutic forests where doctors could prescribe walks. This is not metaphor. Patients receive green prescriptions, specifying duration, frequency, and intensity. The studies of Dr. Ching Li at the Tokyo University of Medicine documented significant reductions in cortisol, blood pressure, and heart rate after just 2 hours of walking in the forest. And they found something fascinating. Phytoncides, the volatile compounds emitted by trees, raise the activity of natural killer cells in your immune system by up to 50%. And the effect persists for at least a week after the walk. Trees quite literally strengthen your immune system just by being near them, just by breathing what they exhale. The program has spread globally. Scotland, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand have similar green prescription programs. European hospitals have begun prescribing walks as part of formal medical protocols, not as a pleasant supplement, as treatment. This connects to something hopeful in oncology. Centers like Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York have implemented progressive walking programs for patients recovering from chemotherapy. Patients who maintained regular walking during and after treatment showed better tolerance to the treatment, lower fatigue levels, and better emotional state. Multiple studies have confirmed that regular walking reduces the risk of breast cancer recurrence by 40 to 50%. Walking does not cure cancer. Surgery and chemotherapy do. But walking gives the body the strength to endure the cure, and the spirit the certainty that it is still capable of moving forward. Rebecca Solnit wrote something in Wanderlust that has stayed with me. She defined walking as a state in which the mind, the body, and the world are aligned. It is a beautiful definition, but also a precise one, because most of the time those three things are disconnected. Your mind is in the future while your body is in a chair and the world is happening on the other side of a window. Walking is the act that puts them back together. Solnit makes a cultural observation that feels urgent. She argues that the privatization of public space and the car-centered design of our cities don't only deprive us of the ability to walk, they deprive us of the ability to be full citizens. Because citizenship doesn't happen in private spaces. It happens in streets, in plazas, in markets. It happens when you walk and run into your neighbor, when you notice a new sign on a storefront, when you see that the park needs repair, and decide to call the city. The car carries you from one private space to another, from your home to your office, from your office to a shopping center, from the center back to your home. You are never really in the city. You are transporting yourself through it. Walking forces you to be in it. History confirms this. The most powerful protest marches in history were exactly that. People walking together. Gandhi walked 386 kilometers to the coast to gather a handful of salt and defy the British Empire. He was 61 years old and walked 16 kilometers a day for 24 days. The Selma to Montgomery March in 1965. 600 people walking 87 kilometers for the right to vote. By the time they reached Montgomery, they were 25,000. 5 months later, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. Walking together is one of the most powerful declarations a group of human beings can make. It requires no weapons, no money, no technology. It requires only people willing to put one foot in front of the other in the same direction, with the same conviction. Gandhi walked an estimated 79,000 kilometers over the course of his life. That is almost twice around the globe. He considered walking a form of prayer in motion. I want to talk about something Cheryl Strayed lived and wrote about in her book Wild, because it contains a truth I think you need to hear. Strayed was 26 when her life collapsed. Her mother had died. Her marriage had fallen apart. She was caught in a downward spiral she didn't know how to escape. With no hiking experience and no preparation, she bought boots and a pack and walked 1,770 kilometers of the Pacific Crest Trail. The walk was brutal, but she wrote a sentence I find one of the most honest things ever written about personal change. I didn't have to be strong every moment. I only had to be strong in the moments that mattered, and putting one foot in front of the other was enough. There is enormous depth in that. She doesn't say she needed superhuman strength. She doesn't say she needed mystical revelation or a sophisticated strategy. She says she needed one foot in front of the other. That personal transformation isn't a single dramatic event, but an accumulation of steps, each of them imperceptible, but together remaking everything. Strayed proved something that connects with everything we have explored. Walking can be an act of reconstruction. Not because the trail magically heals you, but because the discipline of continuing forward when everything in you wants to stop teaches the lesson that endurance is a form of hope. The trail, she said, doesn't give you answers. It makes you forget the wrong questions. Paulo Coelho reached a similar conclusion from a completely different tradition. In The Pilgrimage, his book about the Camino de Santiago, he wrote that the real point of the pilgrimage isn't to arrive in Santiago. It is to find your purpose. The Camino reveals itself differently to each pilgrim because each pilgrim carries different questions. Physical pain is a teacher of impermanence, and the hardest lesson is this. Pay attention to the road, not just the destination. Bill Bryson, in A Walk in the Woods, his comic and disordered account of attempting the Appalachian Trail, offers a necessary counterweight to all this solemnity. Because the truth is that walking can also be ridiculous, uncomfortable, terrifying, and deeply entertaining. Bryson shows that you don't need to finish a trail for the trail to finish what it started in you. That perfect preparation does not exist, and that the wrong companion can ruin a trip, or paradoxically, turn it into the best story of your life. Humor is part of walking. Blisters are part of walking. Getting lost is part of walking. And accepting all of that with grace, with the willingness to laugh at yourself as you keep moving, is perhaps the most useful skill you can cultivate. Not just for walking, for living. Henry David Thoreau gave a minimum of 4 hours a day to walking the woods around Concord, Massachusetts. He considered it not a luxury, but a necessity as essential as breathing. But Thoreau did something few of us do. He distinguished between walking and what he called sauntering. Sauntering, he claimed, comes from the medieval pilgrims who walked to the Holy Land, à la Sainte Terre. For Thoreau, every walk was a small pilgrimage. The difference between commuting and pilgrimage isn't in the distance or the destination, it's in the attitude. To commute is to go from one point to another. To make a pilgrimage is to be entirely present in every step between those 2 points. Thoreau wrote a line that lands harder today than in his own century. The moment my legs begin to move, my thoughts begin to flow. He didn't mean it metaphorically. He was describing an experience that modern neuroscience has confirmed. The default mode network, the brain network that activates during creativity and personal reflection, switches on when you walk without a specific cognitive goal. Thoreau argued we need to walk at least 4 hours a day to maintain the health of the body and the spirit. That seems impossible in modern life. But the provocation is useful because it forces us to ask if 4 hours is the ideal. What does it say about our lives that we cannot find 30 minutes? There is something I want to weave in before we reach the end, because I think it is the thread that ties everything together. In researching this book, a model emerged that I think is the clearest way to understand why walking matters so much. Call it the Pentagon of walking. It has 5 dimensions: body, cardiovascular, metabolic, immunological, longevity. Everything that science measures and confirms. Mind, cognition, creativity, emotional regulation. Everything Nietzsche and Kant lived through and Stanford eventually quantified. Spirit, connection to something larger than yourself. Full presence, a sense of purpose. What Thich Nhat Hanh taught and what pilgrims at Santiago come to understand. Community, social bonds, belonging. What happens when you walk with someone, when you greet a stranger on the trail, when you share a piece of fruit at a lookout point? Landscape, relationship with the earth, ecology, knowledge of the territory. What McFarland describes when he says that walking an ancient path is reading the memory of the land? These 5 dimensions are not independent. They reinforce each other. Walking in nature improves mental and physical health. Doing it with others gives it a deeper sense of purpose. Doing it on an ancient path connects that purpose to something that outlives your own life. Most health interventions work on a single dimension: a pill for the heart, a therapy for the mind, a retreat for the spirit. Walking works on all 5 simultaneously, and it does it for free. And it does it with no side effects. And it is available right now on the other side of your front door. I want to end with something that isn't a story or a fact or a quotation. It's an invitation. Everything you have heard in this book reduces to something you can verify in the next 20 minutes. Not tomorrow. Not Monday. Now. There is an Italian philosopher named Francesco Carreri who walks the edges of cities, the empty lots, the spaces nobody looks at. And he has reached a conclusion I find more radical than any other we've explored. The act of walking precedes architecture itself. The first paths cut by nomadic peoples were the first transformation of the landscape. The first act of construction in human history wasn't raising a wall or stacking one stone on another. It was walking. It was tracing a line with the feet. It was saying, this way leads somewhere. Before houses, before temples, before cities, before highways, before everything we have ever built, there was a human being who walked, and in walking made a path, and that path invited others to follow. And from that invitation, everything else was born. Every time you go out for a walk, you repeat that primordial act. It doesn't matter if it's 5 minutes or 5 months. It doesn't matter if it's around your block or across a mountain range. Every step is a quiet declaration. I am here. I am alive. I am moving. And the entire world opens itself to whoever decides to travel it at the speed of their own feet. You don't need to go far, you only need to begin. The next step is yours.